The screams that shattered the dawn silence in Thornfield Creek on August 7, 1852, weren't coming from the cotton fields where enslaved hands picked under the merciless Texas sun. They were rising from inside the massive cotton gin house where 22-year-old Saphira pressed her back against the wooden door, listening to plantation owner Jorven Stradal burn alive among the very machines that had built his fortune on human suffering. This is the story of how a brilliant woman turned the symbol of cotton slavery into an instrument of justice, and why the Texas Cotton Empire tried to bury her name so deep that historians still struggle to piece together the truth. What happened in that gin house didn't just kill one master. It ignited a wave of resistance that would shake the foundations of slavery across the expanding American West, proving that even in the most remote frontier plantations, the oppressed could engineer their own liberation with devastating precision. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scent of cotton dust and machine oil couldn't mask the stench of human misery that permeated Stradal Plantation that sweltering August morning. Heat waves rose from the red dirt roads that connected the sprawling Texas cotton fields to the massive gin house that dominated the landscape like a cathedral of commerce. The sound of wooden wheels grinding cotton bolls mixed with the rhythmic thump of the steam engine that powered Jorven Stradal's empire, creating a mechanical symphony that had been the soundtrack of enslaved lives for nearly a decade. Thornfield Creek stretched across the eastern edge of what would later become known as the heart of Texas cotton country, but in 1852 it was still frontier territory, where fortunes were made by men willing to risk everything on land, machinery, and human property. The Colorado River wound through the valley like a brown ribbon, carrying steamboats loaded with compressed cotton bales north to Houston and eventually to the mills of New England and England itself. The texture of wealth was everywhere in the Stradal operation, in the imported brass fittings on the gin machinery shipped from Massachusetts, in the fine-cut lumber that formed the gin house walls, each board perfectly planed and fitted, in the way even the overseer's quarters were built with glass windows while the enslaved people lived in windowless cabins that baked like ovens in the Texas heat. Stradal Plantation represented the new face of American slavery in the 1850s, a mechanized operation that combined the old brutalities with industrial efficiency. The cotton gin house itself stood 3 stories tall, its steam-powered machinery capable of processing more raw cotton in a single day than traditional hand methods could handle in a month. The building's wooden frame construction, necessary for housing the heavy machinery, created a structure that was both the plantation's greatest asset and its most dangerous vulnerability. The gin house operated on a brutal schedule dictated by the cotton harvest season. From dawn until well past sunset, enslaved workers fed raw cotton into the mechanical teeth that separated fiber from seed, their hands moving with practiced precision. Despite the constant danger of the unguarded machinery, the air inside was thick with cotton dust that coated everything in a fine white powder, making breathing difficult and visibility poor even on the brightest days. Steam from the boiler that powered the gin created a hellish atmosphere inside the building, with temperatures often exceeding 110 degrees. The noise was deafening. The hiss of steam, the clatter of wooden gears, the rhythmic thumping of the engine, and the constant whoosh of cotton being processed through the mechanical system. Workers communicated through hand signals and learned to read each other's lips, their voices lost in the industrial cacophony. The layout of the gin house reflected both efficiency and control. Raw cotton entered through large doors on the ground floor, where it was fed into the gin machinery. The cleaned cotton fiber was then pressed into bales on the second floor, using a massive screw press operated by a team of 6 men. The third floor served as storage for the finished bales before they were loaded onto wagons for transport to the river. Every movement was supervised, every process timed and measured for maximum output. But the gin house held secrets that Jorven Stradal never suspected. Hidden behind the massive wooden support beams and beneath the floorboards were small caches of items that told a different story about the people who worked there. A broken piece of mirror used to signal between the gin house and the fields. A collection of smooth river stones arranged in patterns that conveyed information about patrol schedules. Small strips of cloth tied in specific knots that indicated when the overseer would be away from his post. The water system that fed the steam boiler created another layer of vulnerability that the plantation's white management never fully understood. The wooden pipes that carried water from Thornfield Creek to the gin house ran beneath the building's foundation, creating a network of accessible spaces where items could be hidden and messages passed. The constant need for boiler maintenance meant that enslaved workers had legitimate reasons to access areas of the building that were normally off-limits. Fire was both the gin house's power source and its greatest threat. The steam boiler required constant feeding of wood and coal, creating enormous heat that had to be carefully managed to prevent the cotton dust in the air from igniting. The building's wooden construction and the highly flammable nature of cotton fiber meant that even small fires could spread with devastating speed. Fire buckets were positioned throughout the building, but they were intended to protect the valuable machinery and cotton, not the people who operated the equipment. The gin house's location on a slight rise overlooking Thornfield Creek provided excellent visibility of the surrounding fields, making it an ideal observation post for anyone who understood how to read the landscape. From the third-floor windows, an observer could see the main house, the overseer's quarters, the workers, cabins, and most importantly, the roads that connected the plantation to the outside world. This vantage point also revealed the movement patterns of the plantation's guards and the timing of their patrols. The machinery itself was a marvel of 1850s engineering, but it was also a maze of moving parts, steam pipes, and mechanical systems that few people fully understood. The enslaved workers who operated the equipment daily had developed an intimate knowledge of every gear, lever, and pressure gauge that their supervisors lacked. They knew which parts of the system were most likely to fail, which safety mechanisms could be bypassed, and most importantly, which components were critical to the entire operation. The social dynamics within the gin house created their own hidden networks. Workers developed systems of mutual protection, warning signals for when supervisors were approaching, and methods for sharing information that appeared to be simple work-related communication. The constant noise and activity provided perfect cover for conversations that would have been impossible in the quieter environment of the fields or living quarters. The gin house represented more than just a workplace to the enslaved people who labored there. It was the heart of the economic system that held them in bondage, the machine that transformed their daily suffering into the profits that kept them enslaved. Every bale of cotton that passed through those mechanical teeth represented not just processed fiber, but processed human lives, time stolen, families separated, dreams destroyed for the sake of white wealth and comfort. The building's rhythms had become the rhythms of their lives, the mechanical heartbeat that counted out their days in measured intervals of productivity and exhaustion. But for someone with the intelligence to understand the system's weaknesses and the courage to act on that knowledge, the gin house could become something else entirely. Not just the symbol of their oppression, but the instrument of their liberation. Saphira had been the property of Jorven Stradal for 5 years, purchased in 1847 from a failing plantation in Louisiana for the considerable sum of $1.200. The bill of sale described her as one Negro girl, approximately 17 years of age, house-trained, literate, suitable for indoor or mechanical work. What the legal document couldn't capture was the steel-trap mind that had already begun calculating the exact specifications of every piece of machinery she would soon be operating. Born on a sugar plantation outside New Orleans, Saphira had learned to read by observing the plantation owner's daughters during their lessons, memorizing letters and sounds from her position serving tea in the parlor. Her quick intelligence had been recognized early by the overseer's wife, who had secretly taught her arithmetic and basic engineering principles, believing that educated workers were more valuable than ignorant ones. This knowledge would prove far more dangerous than anyone imagined. The texture of survival had been Saphira's education for as long as she could remember. She understood that intelligence was a weapon that had to be concealed, that asking too many questions could result in punishment, and that the appearance of simple compliance was often the most effective form of rebellion. Her hands had learned to work efficiently, while her mind cataloged every weakness in the systems designed to control her. When Jorven Stradal purchased the Louisiana plantation's human property at auction, he believed he was acquiring a valuable asset for his new Texas operation. Saphira's ability to read and perform calculations made her ideal for the record-keeping required in the gin house, where cotton weights, processing times, and machinery maintenance schedules had to be tracked with precision. What Stradal failed to recognize was that these same skills would allow her to understand his business operations more completely than he understood them himself. The journey from Louisiana to Texas had taken 3 weeks in a wagon train that included 12 other enslaved people, farm equipment, and household goods. During those weeks of travel, Saphira had observed the landscape, noted the locations of towns and river crossings, and most importantly, listened to conversations between Stradal and his associates about the cotton market, shipping schedules, and the political tensions that were dividing the country over the expansion of slavery. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Stradal himself was a man driven by ambitions that extended far beyond simple profit. He envisioned building a cotton empire that would rival the established plantations of the Deep South, but he was hampered by his relative inexperience and his tendency to underestimate both the challenges of frontier farming and the intelligence of the people he owned. His background as a merchant from Pennsylvania had given him knowledge of markets and machinery, but had not prepared him for the complex dynamics of managing enslaved labor. The master's personality revealed itself in contradictions that Saphira learned to read like a map. He prided himself on running a modern operation that relied on efficiency rather than excessive punishment, yet he had no hesitation about using violence when his authority was challenged. He spoke frequently about the civilizing influence of slavery on African people, yet he lived in constant fear that his human property might rebel against him. He invested heavily in the latest machinery and agricultural techniques, yet he failed to understand that the people operating his equipment were learning from every innovation. Saphira's position in the gin house hierarchy was unique and strategically valuable. As the only enslaved person on the plantation who could read and perform complex calculations, she was responsible for maintaining the operational records that Stradal relied on to make business decisions. This role gave her access to information about cotton prices, shipping schedules, equipment maintenance needs, and most importantly, the financial pressures that were beginning to strain the plantation's operations. The gin house work schedule created natural opportunities for observation and planning. Saphira's duties required her to move throughout the building at different times of day, checking machinery, recording production numbers, and supervising the more routine work performed by other enslaved people. This mobility allowed her to study every aspect of the building's construction and operation, while appearing to focus solely on her assigned tasks. Her living quarters were located in a small room adjacent to the gin house, officially to allow her to respond quickly to machinery problems, but actually providing her with unprecedented access to the building during the overnight hours, when most supervision was relaxed. This proximity also meant that she was intimately familiar with the sounds and rhythms of the machinery, able to distinguish between normal operation and the subtle changes that indicated potential mechanical problems. The other enslaved people on the plantation had gradually recognized Saphira's intelligence and begun to seek her guidance on matters ranging from work assignments to personal conflicts. She had become an unofficial leader within the enslaved community, a role that brought both influence and responsibility. Her ability to read meant that she could interpret the newspapers and letters that occasionally made their way to the plantation, providing information about the outside world that was otherwise unavailable to her fellow workers. Through her access to Stradal's correspondence and business records, Saphira had developed a sophisticated understanding of the cotton market and the economic forces that drove the plantation system. She knew that falling cotton prices and rising equipment costs were creating financial pressure on plantation owners throughout Texas. She understood that the political debates over slavery's expansion were creating uncertainty in the markets that depended on enslaved labor. Most importantly, she recognized that the plantation's profitability depended on a delicate balance of factors that could be disrupted by someone who understood the system's vulnerabilities. The psychological burden of maintaining her facade of compliance while planning resistance had been enormous. Every day brought fresh reminders of her powerlessness, the casual brutality of the overseer, the separation of families when economic necessity required sales, the constant awareness that her own intelligence made her valuable property that would never be willingly freed. The weight of these experiences had not broken her spirit, but had instead crystallized her determination to find a way to strike back at the system that had stolen her life. Saphira's knowledge of mechanical systems extended beyond simple operation to a deep understanding of the engineering principles that governed the gin house machinery. She had learned to recognize the stress points in the wooden framework, the pressure tolerances of the steam system, and the critical components whose failure could shut down the entire operation. This technical knowledge, combined with her access to records about maintenance schedules and equipment suppliers, had given her insights into the plantation's vulnerabilities that no one else possessed. The breaking point that would transform theoretical knowledge into deadly action was approaching, though Saphira didn't yet know its exact form. The accumulation of daily humiliations, the constant threat of violence, and the knowledge that her intelligence was being used to strengthen the very system that oppressed her, had created a psychological pressure that was reaching critical levels. Like the steam building in the gin house boiler, this pressure would eventually find a way to escape, and the explosion would reshape everything in its path. Her planning had begun as a form of mental exercise, a way to maintain sanity by imagining scenarios where she possessed agency and power, instead of being merely property to be used and disposed of. But as her understanding of the plantation's operations deepened and her access to critical information expanded, these mental exercises had evolved into something far more concrete and dangerous, a blueprint for liberation that would require only the right moment and the courage to act. The woman who served Jorven Stradal his morning coffee and recorded his daily production figures had become something that the plantation system was never designed to accommodate, an expert in the very machinery and processes that made cotton slavery profitable, with both the intelligence to identify fatal weaknesses and the desperation necessary to exploit them without regard for the consequences to herself. The first crack in Saphira's carefully maintained facade appeared in the spring of 1852, when Jorven Stradal discovered her reading a newspaper that had been left in the gin house office. The newspaper wasn't contraband. Enslaved people were sometimes required to read work-related documents aloud, but this particular paper contained articles about slave revolts in other states, and Stradal had noticed her lingering over those sections with an intensity that troubled him. The punishment was swift and calculated to humiliate, rather than simply cause pain. Saphira was forced to stand in the center of the gin house during the busiest part of the workday, while Stradal read aloud from a children's primer, ordering her to repeat each simple sentence as if she were learning to read for the first time. The other workers were required to watch and laugh at appropriate moments, creating a theater of degradation that was designed to reinforce the hierarchy that kept the plantation functioning. But the humiliation had an unintended effect. Rather than breaking Saphira's spirit, it revealed to her fellow workers that their unofficial leader possessed knowledge and intelligence that their master found threatening. The forced laughter concealed meaningful glances and subtle gestures of support that strengthened rather than weakened the bonds within the enslaved community. Stradal's attempt to isolate Saphira had instead confirmed her status as someone worth following. The incident also marked the beginning of increased surveillance that made Saphira's movements more difficult and dangerous. Arendor Valcrest, the plantation's overseer, began making unannounced visits to the gin house at irregular hours, checking on work progress but clearly searching for signs of insubordination or suspicious behavior. His presence disrupted the informal communication networks that had developed among the workers, and forced Saphira to be more creative in her planning and observation. Economic pressures were mounting on the plantation throughout the spring and early summer of 1852. Cotton prices had fallen significantly from their peaks of the previous decade, while the costs of machinery, transportation, and enslaved labor continued to rise. Saphira's access to Stradal's correspondence revealed his growing desperation as creditors demanded payment and suppliers required cash for equipment repairs. The financial stress was making him more volatile and unpredictable, prone to sudden rages and arbitrary punishments. The machinery itself was beginning to show signs of the strain created by Stradal's cost-cutting measures. Routine maintenance was being deferred to save money, and replacement parts were being fabricated locally rather than ordered from the original manufacturers. Saphira observed that the steam system was operating at higher pressures than recommended, creating dangerous conditions that could result in catastrophic failure if not properly managed. These mechanical problems created opportunities for sabotage, but they also increased the risks for everyone working in the gin house. A new development in June threatened to disrupt Saphira's plans entirely. Stradal announced that he was considering selling several of his human assets to raise cash for debt payments, and Saphira's name was on the preliminary list of people to be sold. Her literacy and mechanical skills made her valuable, but those same qualities also made her potentially dangerous in the eyes of a master who was beginning to question the loyalty of his workforce. The possibility of sale created a desperate urgency in Saphira's planning. If she were sold to another plantation, her intimate knowledge of the gin house machinery and her access to the building would be lost. More importantly, separation from the community of people who had begun to look to her for leadership would eliminate her ability to organize any kind of coordinated resistance. Time was running out for any action that depended on her current position and relationships. Personal tragedy struck in July when Kyla Veyral, a young woman who had become like a sister to Saphira, died from injuries sustained in a gin house accident. The official story was that Kyla had gotten her sleeve caught in the machinery while feeding cotton into the gin, but Saphira knew that the accident had been caused by the deferred maintenance that had left safety guards broken and dangerous mechanical components exposed. Kyla's death was not murder in the legal sense, but it was the predictable result of prioritizing profits over human safety. The burial that followed revealed both the cruelty and the vulnerability of the plantation system. Stradal allowed only a brief ceremony before demanding that the workers return to their duties, showing no recognition that a human being had died or that her death had been preventable. But the funeral also demonstrated the solidarity within the enslaved community and their shared determination to honor their dead despite the circumstances that had killed her. Saphira's grief over Kyla's death was compounded by rage at a system that treated human life as an expendable resource in the pursuit of profit. The accident had been entirely preventable. A simple safety guard that cost less than $5 could have saved Kyla's life, but Stradal's cost-cutting measures had created conditions where such accidents were inevitable. The death served as a brutal reminder that the machinery that enriched the master was literally consuming the lives of the people forced to operate it. The emotional impact of losing Kyla was intensified by practical concerns about the plantation's response to the accident. Rather than improving safety conditions, Stradal decided that the solution was to increase supervision and implement new rules that restricted workers, movements, and reduced their ability to communicate with each other. The gin house work environment became more oppressive and tightly controlled, making any kind of planning or coordination more difficult. Investigations into the accident revealed details about the gin house operations that had previously been hidden from Stradal's direct oversight. He discovered that workers had developed their own safety procedures and communication systems that operated independently of official supervision. This revelation led to a systematic effort to break up informal networks and impose more rigid control over every aspect of the work process. The increased scrutiny created new dangers for Saphira specifically. Her role in maintaining production records meant that she was frequently questioned about discrepancies between official procedures and actual work practices. Her answers had to be carefully crafted to avoid revealing her knowledge of the informal systems that had helped protect workers from some of the machinery's dangers, while also avoiding any admission that could be interpreted as insubordination. August brought the cotton harvest season, and with it the most intensive period of gin house operations. The machinery ran from dawn until well past sunset, processing the cotton that would determine the plantation's financial survival for another year. The increased workload created both opportunities and risks for anyone contemplating action against the system. The constant activity provided cover for unusual movements and preparations, but it also meant that any disruption would have maximum impact on the plantation's operations. The harvest season also brought visiting cotton buyers and inspectors who evaluated the quality of the plantation's output and negotiated prices for the year's crop. These outsiders represented both potential witnesses to any dramatic events and possible sources of information about conditions on other plantations. Their presence forced Stradal to maintain appearances of proper management while also creating additional pressure to maximize production regardless of the cost in human suffering. Personal tensions within the enslaved community were reaching a breaking point as the combination of grief, increased supervision, and harvest season exhaustion pushed everyone to their physical and emotional limits. Some workers advocated for open resistance despite the certainty of violent retaliation, while others argued for patience and caution. Saphira found herself caught between these competing approaches, knowing that any action she took would affect not just herself but the entire community that had come to depend on her leadership. The final straw came on August 5th, when Stradal announced that he had decided to sell not just individual enslaved people, but to liquidate his entire human holdings and lease workers from other plantations for the following year. This decision would break up families and destroy the community that had developed over the plantation's 5-year existence. For Saphira, it meant that any action she was going to take had to happen immediately, before the approaching sale scattered her people across Texas and eliminated forever her opportunity to strike back at the system that had destroyed so many lives. The announcement created a sense of desperate urgency that made rational planning almost impossible while simultaneously making action absolutely necessary. The window for resistance was closing rapidly, and the consequences of either action or inaction had become equally devastating. The careful balance that had allowed Saphira to gather information and develop plans was collapsing under the pressure of immediate threats to everything and everyone she cared about. The plan that crystallized in Saphira's mind during those final 48 hours before Stradal's announcement was not born from sudden inspiration but from months of careful observation and analysis. Every detail had been examined, every vulnerability catalogued, every potential consequence weighed against the certainty of continued suffering under the current system. What emerged was not a desperate act of revenge, but a precisely calculated strategy designed to achieve maximum disruption with minimal risk to the people she sought to protect. The gin house machinery had become as familiar to Saphira as her own heartbeat. She knew that the steam boiler required constant pressure to operate the mechanical systems, and that this pressure was regulated by a series of valves and gauges that most people, including Stradal and his overseer, did not fully understand. The boiler was fed by a firebox that burned wood and coal, creating the steam that powered the entire operation. This fire was maintained constantly during processing season, making the gin house essentially a controlled explosion that required careful management to prevent catastrophe. More importantly, Saphira had discovered that the building's ventilation system, designed to remove cotton dust and heat, could be manipulated to create conditions that would turn the gin house into a massive furnace. The wooden construction of the building and the constant presence of highly flammable cotton fiber meant that a fire started in the right location with proper airflow could consume the entire structure in a matter of minutes. The cotton processing schedule provided the perfect opportunity for action. On August 7th, a large shipment of raw cotton was scheduled to arrive from outlying fields, requiring an intensive processing session that would keep the machinery running at maximum capacity for 12 to 14 hours. Stradal always personally supervised these major processing days, positioning himself in the gin house office on the second floor where he could observe operations while reviewing shipping documents and calculating profits. Saphira's access to the maintenance schedules revealed that the safety systems intended to prevent fires had been compromised by months of deferred repairs. The water pumps that were supposed to supply emergency firefighting equipment had not been properly maintained, and several of the fire buckets positioned throughout the building were cracked or missing entirely. The building's fire safety depended almost entirely on preventing problems rather than responding to them, a critical weakness that could be exploited by someone who understood the systems involved. The chemical storage area in the basement of the gin house contained materials that could accelerate a fire beyond any possibility of control. Turpentine used for machinery maintenance, kerosene for lighting, and various oils and solvents created a collection of accelerants that had been placed in the building for legitimate purposes, but could serve very different functions in the right circumstances. Access to this storage area was normally restricted, but Saphira's maintenance responsibilities gave her legitimate reasons to be there. Over the preceding weeks, Saphira had begun making subtle preparations that would support her plan without arousing suspicion. Small amounts of cotton fiber had been collected and hidden in strategic locations throughout the building, creating a network of potential fuel sources that could rapidly spread fire from one area to another. These preparations were disguised as routine cleaning activities, with cotton waste being moved to different locations for seemingly normal operational reasons. The building's wooden support structure had several critical weakness points that Saphira had identified through careful observation. The main support beams that held up the second and third floors were constructed of pine lumber that had been drying for over a decade, making them highly susceptible to fire. More importantly, these beams were located in areas where small fires could be started without immediate detection, allowing flames to gain strength before anyone realized what was happening. The steam system itself provided the most devastating potential for destruction. Saphira had learned that if the pressure in the boiler was allowed to build beyond safe levels while simultaneously blocking the steam release valves, the resulting explosion would not only destroy the gin house, but would scatter burning debris across a wide area. This knowledge was dangerous even to possess, representing the kind of information that could result in immediate execution if discovered by plantation authorities. Communication with other enslaved people had to be handled with extreme care, using systems that had been developed over months of careful practice. Messages were passed through work songs with coded lyrics that conveyed specific information about timing and procedures. Hand signals developed for use in the noisy gin house environment could communicate complex instructions without attracting attention from supervisors. Most importantly, a system of seeming coincidences and accidental encounters allowed for brief conversations that appeared completely innocent to outside observers. The most challenging aspect of the planning involved ensuring the safety of the other workers who would be in the gin house when the action took place. Saphira had identified several critical moments during the processing schedule when most workers would be outside the building, either bringing in raw cotton or moving finished bales to storage areas. The timing of the action would have to be coordinated with these natural gaps in the work schedule to minimize the risk to innocent people. Escape routes had been carefully planned and memorized, though Saphira understood that her own survival was far from certain. The primary objective was not her personal safety but the destruction of the economic heart of the plantation and the demonstration that enslaved people possessed both the intelligence and the courage to strike back at their oppressors. If she survived the immediate action, secondary plans existed for moving away from the plantation and potentially linking up with communities of free people or other resistance networks. The psychological preparation for what she was planning to do required Saphira to confront the reality that she was preparing to kill another human being, even though that person was her oppressor. The moral weight of this decision was enormous, but it was balanced against the knowledge that Stradal's continued existence meant the continued suffering and death of dozens of enslaved people. Kyla's death had provided a stark reminder that the plantation system was already killing people through neglect and exploitation. The proposed action would simply make that violence more visible and direct. Timing was critical not just for the immediate action, but for its broader impact. The cotton processing season represented the peak of the plantation's economic activity, meaning that the destruction of the gin house would have maximum financial impact on Stradal and his creditors. The approaching sale of the plantation's enslaved people meant that action had to be taken immediately, or the opportunity would be lost forever. Most importantly, the current period of intensive work provided both cover for preparations and the best chance for achieving the total destruction that would make the action impossible to ignore or minimize. The final element of the plan involved ensuring that the action would be understood as a deliberate act of resistance rather than an accident or random tragedy. Saphira prepared a written statement explaining her motivations and objectives to be left in a location where it would be discovered after the action was completed. This document would serve both as a historical record and as inspiration for others who might be contemplating similar actions against the system of slavery. Physical preparations included gathering the materials necessary for starting and controlling fires, positioning these materials in strategic locations throughout the gin house, and testing various methods for igniting flammable substances under different conditions. This work had to be done gradually over several weeks, with each preparation disguised as routine maintenance or cleaning activity. The accumulated materials and preparations represented a sophisticated understanding of fire dynamics and structural engineering that no one suspected an enslaved person could possess. The complexity of coordinating all these elements while maintaining the appearance of normal compliance required extraordinary mental discipline and emotional control. Every conversation had to be carefully monitored for signs that might reveal the true nature of what was being planned. Every action had to serve multiple purposes, advancing the plan while also fulfilling legitimate work responsibilities. The psychological pressure of maintaining this deception while preparing for such a dramatic action was enormous, but it was sustained by the knowledge that the alternative was continued submission to a system that was slowly destroying everyone she cared about. As August 7th approached, all the elements of the plan had been carefully positioned and tested. The materials were in place, the timing had been confirmed, the safety of other workers had been considered, and the psychological preparation had been completed. What remained was the execution of a plan that would either succeed completely or fail with devastating consequences for everyone involved. There would be no partial success. No opportunity for retreat or reconsideration once the action began. The moment for half measures and compromise had passed. What remained was the test of whether careful planning and desperate courage could overcome the machinery of oppression that had seemed invincible for so long. August 7th dawned with the oppressive heat that had characterized the Texas summer, but the air carried an unusual stillness that seemed to press against the earth like a held breath. The cotton shipment arrived before sunrise, massive wagons loaded with raw bolls that would keep the gin house machinery running at maximum capacity throughout the day. Saphira moved through her morning preparations with practiced efficiency, her outward calm masking the explosive tension that had been building in her chest for weeks. The gin house came alive with its familiar symphony of mechanical noise, as the steam boiler was fired and the machinery began its rhythmic processing of cotton. Workers moved through their assigned tasks with the fluid coordination that came from years of experience, feeding raw cotton into the mechanical teeth that separated fiber from seed, operating the massive press that compressed cleaned cotton into transportable bales, and maintaining the steam pressure that powered the entire operation. Jorven Stradal positioned himself in his second-floor office as usual, surrounded by shipping documents and account books that tracked the financial success of the day's operations. From his elevated position, he could observe the entire first floor of the gin house while remaining removed from the noise and dust that made ground-level supervision uncomfortable. This habitual location would prove to be both his vantage point for overseeing his empire and his trap when that empire began to consume itself. Saphira had carefully timed her preparations to coincide with the natural rhythms of the gin house operations. At precisely 10:30 in the morning, when most workers were occupied with moving a large batch of processed cotton to the pressing area, she made her way to the basement storage room where months of planning would finally be translated into action. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her hands remained steady as she began implementing the sequence of actions that would transform the gin house from a symbol of oppression into an instrument of liberation. The first step involved the chemical accelerants that had been positioned throughout the building over the preceding weeks. Small amounts of turpentine and kerosene, ostensibly stored for legitimate maintenance purposes, had been moved to locations where they could create maximum impact when ignited. Cotton fiber that had been carefully positioned to create pathways for fire spread would ensure that once started, the flames would move through the building faster than any human response could contain them. The steam system required the most delicate manipulation, as the goal was to create conditions that would prevent effective firefighting while also generating the maximum possible destruction. Saphira had studied the pressure gauges and steam release valves until she understood exactly how to create a situation where the boiler would continue generating steam and heat even as the building around it caught fire. The result would be a feedback loop where the fire would be fed by the very system that powered the plantation's operations. Moving through the building with the practiced invisibility that enslaved people had perfected over generations, Saphira began igniting the prepared accelerants in a carefully planned sequence. Each fire was small at first, hidden behind machinery or in storage areas where it would have time to grow before being discovered. The cotton dust that filled the air would help carry the flames from one ignition point to another, creating a network of fires that would be impossible to fight individually. The wooden support structure of the building had been her particular focus during the planning stages, and now those months of observation paid off as she targeted the critical load-bearing beams that held up the upper floors. Small fires started at the base of these supports would weaken the structural integrity of the entire building, while also creating conditions that would make escape from the upper floors increasingly difficult for anyone trapped there. As the first wisps of smoke began to rise from the basement storage areas, Saphira made her way back to the main floor of the gin house, where the normal operations continued without any awareness of what was already beginning to unfold beneath their feet. The noise of the machinery masked the subtle sounds of crackling flames, and the constant presence of steam from the boiler disguised the early signs of smoke that were beginning to seep through the floorboards. The critical moment arrived when someone finally noticed that the smoke rising in the building was not coming from the steam system but from actual fires that were spreading through the structure. The first shouts of alarm came from workers on the ground floor who realized that the gin house was beginning to burn around them, but by that time the fires had gained too much strength to be controlled by the limited firefighting equipment that was available. Panic spread through the building as workers realized that their workplace was becoming a death trap. The primary exits became crowded with people trying to escape. while others attempted to fight the fires with the inadequate buckets and pumps that were supposed to provide emergency protection. The mechanical systems continued operating, even as smoke began filling the air, creating a surreal scene where the machinery of cotton processing continued its rhythmic work, while the building that housed it began to consume itself. Saphira used the confusion to position herself near the main staircase that led to Stradal's second-floor office, where she could observe the master's reaction to the destruction of his empire while ensuring that he would not be able to escape before experiencing the full magnitude of what was happening to his plantation. Her position also allowed her to direct other workers towards safer exits while maintaining her cover as someone trying to help with the emergency, rather than someone who had created it. The moment when Jorven Stradal realized that his gin house was beyond saving was visible on his face as he appeared at the top of the staircase, clutching ledger books and shipping documents that represented the financial heart of his operations. The smoke was now thick enough to make breathing difficult, and the heat was beginning to reach levels that made remaining in the building dangerous for anyone not specifically prepared for the conditions that were developing. But Stradal's attempt to escape was blocked by the strategic placement of fires that had made the main staircase impassable. The wooden stairs were already beginning to burn, and the smoke was so thick that navigation was becoming impossible even for someone familiar with the building's layout. His shouts for help were lost in the noise of collapsing machinery and crackling flames that had grown from small ignition points into a conflagration that was consuming everything in its path. The steam boiler system, still operating under pressure even as the building burned around it, created conditions that prevented any effective firefighting response. The heat and steam made approach to the fires impossible, while the mechanical noise of the still operating gin machinery masked the sounds that might have allowed for coordinated response efforts. The very systems that had made the plantation profitable were now working to ensure its complete destruction. Saphira positioned herself near the main door of the gin house, ostensibly helping to coordinate the evacuation, but actually ensuring that she could observe and control the final stages of her plan. From this position, she could see that the fires had achieved the chain reaction she had carefully engineered, with each burning area feeding the spread of flames to other parts of the building, while creating conditions that made escape from the upper floors increasingly impossible. The sound that would haunt everyone present came when the main support beams finally succumbed to the fire damage and began to collapse, bringing down sections of the second floor in crashes that could be heard across the entire plantation. These structural failures created new pathways for air to feed the flames, while also generating sparks and burning debris that spread the fire to areas that had not yet been directly affected by the original ignition points. Jorven Stradal's final moments were spent trapped in his office, surrounded by the account books and shipping documents that represented his life's work, while the building that had been the source of his wealth became his funeral pyre. His screams carried across the plantation grounds, audible even over the roar of the fire and the crash of collapsing machinery, creating a sound that would be remembered by everyone who heard it as the moment when the natural order of the plantation system was violently reversed. The cotton gin that had processed thousands of bales of cotton picked by enslaved hands was consuming itself along with its owner, turning the symbol of plantation prosperity into a monument to the costs of building wealth on human suffering. The machinery that had seemed so permanent and powerful was revealed to be as vulnerable to destruction as the people who had been forced to operate it, demonstrating that the systems of oppression could be dismantled by those who understood their workings well enough to turn their strengths into weaknesses. As the gin house collapsed into a pile of burning debris that would smolder for days, Saphira stood among the crowd of workers and neighbors who had gathered to watch the destruction, her face reflecting the same shock and horror that everyone else displayed, while inside she felt a satisfaction that was deeper and more complete than anything she had ever experienced. The master was dead, the economic heart of the plantation was destroyed, and the demonstration had been made that enslaved people possessed both the intelligence and the courage to strike back at the system that oppressed them. The fire that consumed the Stradal plantation gin house burned with an intensity that seemed to draw its power from years of accumulated suffering and rage, transforming the mechanical heart of cotton slavery into a beacon that would be visible for miles across the Texas countryside. The message carried by that fire would travel far beyond the boundaries of a single plantation, reaching other enslaved communities with the news that resistance was possible, and that even the most powerful masters were vulnerable to the intelligence and determination of the people they had underestimated for so long. The smoke column that rose from the Stradal plantation gin house could be seen from 10 miles away, a black pillar against the August sky that drew riders from neighboring plantations like moths to flame. By noon, a crowd of planters, overseers, and local officials had gathered at the smoldering ruins, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, fear, and barely concealed panic as they contemplated what the destruction meant for their own operations and safety. The immediate response revealed how unprepared the Texas cotton establishment was for deliberate acts of resistance. Sheriff Caesar Farrowen arrived from the county's seat with 2 deputies, but their experience was limited to pursuing runaway enslaved people and settling disputes between white landowners. They had no training in investigating what appeared to be an act of sabotage, and their initial efforts focused more on maintaining order among the crowd of spectators than on gathering evidence about what had actually occurred. The physical evidence told a story that the investigating officials were reluctant to acknowledge. The pattern of fire damage indicated multiple ignition points throughout the building, with clear signs that accelerants had been used to ensure rapid spread of the flames. The basement storage area showed evidence of systematic preparation, with containers that had held turpentine and kerosene positioned in locations that maximized their impact on the building's destruction. Most troubling to the investigators was the discovery that critical safety equipment had been disabled or moved before the fire started. Arendor Vallecrest, the plantation overseer who had survived the fire by being in the fields when it started, provided testimony that raised more questions than it answered. He reported that Saphira had been acting normally throughout the morning, performing her usual duties without any signs of unusual behavior. However, when pressed for details about her movements during the critical hours before the fire, he admitted that the complexity of gin house operations made it impossible to track any individual worker's activities with precision. The discovery of Jorven Stradal's body in his office created additional complications for the investigation. The master had clearly been trapped by the fire and had died from smoke inhalation and burns, but the specific circumstances that had prevented his escape raised questions about whether the fire had been deliberately designed to target him personally. The fact that other workers had been able to evacuate safely while the plantation owner had died suggested a level of planning that went beyond simple arson. The enslaved community's response to the tragedy was carefully orchestrated to avoid revealing any knowledge of what had actually occurred. Workers expressed appropriate shock and grief over the destruction of their workplace, while maintaining complete ignorance about how the fire had started or why it had spread so rapidly. Their testimony to investigators followed a consistent pattern of cooperation that revealed nothing useful, while appearing completely forthcoming and honest. Saphira herself played her role as a traumatized survivor with consummate skill, displaying the appropriate level of shock and grief, while providing information that supported the investigators' preferred theory that the fire had been an accident caused by faulty equipment or careless handling of flammable materials. Her detailed knowledge of the gin house operations made her a valuable witness, and her apparent cooperation convinced the investigators that she could not have been involved in any deliberate sabotage. However, the investigation took an unexpected turn when officials discovered the written statement that Saphira had prepared and hidden in the ruins of the gin house. The document, protected from the fire by being sealed in a metal container, contained a detailed confession that explained not only how the fire had been started, but why it had been necessary to destroy the plantation's economic foundation. The articulate and sophisticated language of the statement shocked investigators who had never considered that an enslaved person could possess such intelligence and education. The confession revealed the extent of the planning that had preceded the fire, including months of preparation, careful study of the building's vulnerabilities, and strategic positioning of materials that would ensure maximum destruction. More disturbing to the authorities was the statement's explanation of the economic reasoning behind the attack, demonstrating an understanding of cotton market dynamics and plantation finances that rivaled that of established planters. News of the confession spread rapidly through the white community, creating panic among plantation owners who suddenly realized that their human property might possess knowledge and capabilities that made them far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The idea that enslaved people could plan and execute sophisticated attacks on the economic infrastructure of slavery challenged fundamental assumptions about racial intelligence and the security of the plantation system. The search for Saphira began immediately after the discovery of her confession, but she had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed her. None of the enslaved people questioned by investigators claimed any knowledge of her whereabouts, and searches of the plantation grounds and surrounding areas revealed no trace of her location. The woman who had destroyed the gin house had disappeared into the Texas landscape with the same methodical planning that had characterized her attack. Neighboring plantations responded to the Stradal fire with a mixture of increased security measures and desperate attempts to assess their own vulnerabilities. Emergency meetings were held throughout the region as planters shared information about suspicious incidents on their own properties and debated whether the Thornfield Creek attack was an isolated event or the beginning of a coordinated campaign of resistance. The economic impact of the destruction extended far beyond the immediate loss of the gin house and processing equipment. Cotton buyers who had contracted for Stradal's crop were forced to seek alternative sources, driving up prices and creating shortages that affected the entire regional market. Insurance companies that had provided coverage for plantation equipment began demanding higher premiums and more stringent security requirements, making the cost of operations significantly more expensive for all planters. The psychological impact proved even more devastating than the economic consequences. Plantation families found themselves unable to sleep peacefully in houses maintained by people who might be planning their destruction. The intimate nature of household slavery, once viewed as evidence of mutual affection between masters and enslaved people, now seemed like an invitation to murder. Every meal prepared by enslaved cooks became suspect. Every fire lit by enslaved hands raised questions about potential sabotage. The response from Texas state authorities reflected the broader political tensions that were dividing the nation over slavery's expansion. Governor Nelson Velthar ordered a full investigation into the incident, while simultaneously implementing new laws that restricted the movement of enslaved people and increased penalties for any acts of resistance. The state legislature debated proposals for mandatory education restrictions that would prevent enslaved people from learning to read and write, recognizing that literacy had been essential to the planning of the Thornfield Creek attack. Federal officials monitoring the situation from Washington were particularly concerned about the implications for westward expansion and the establishment of new slave territories. The Stradal fire demonstrated that the plantation system could face sophisticated resistance even in frontier areas where traditional forms of social control were less developed. Reports to Congress emphasized the potential for similar attacks to disrupt the economic development of territories where slavery was being established. The investigation's focus gradually shifted from solving the immediate crime to preventing future incidents of resistance. Military officials were consulted about security measures that could protect plantation infrastructure from internal sabotage, while legal experts drafted new ordinances that would give authorities broader powers to monitor and control enslaved populations. The response revealed how thoroughly the single action at Thornfield Creek had shaken the confidence of the entire Texas cotton establishment. Religious authorities throughout the region struggled to reconcile the violent destruction with their teachings about slavery as a divinely ordained institution. Some ministers preached that the fire was divine punishment for insufficient Christian instruction of enslaved people, while others argued that it proved the inherent savagery of Africans who rejected the civilizing influence of bondage. The theological debates reflected broader uncertainties about how to maintain ideological support for slavery in the face of evidence that enslaved people possessed intelligence and agency that contradicted racial stereotypes. The reaction within enslaved communities across Texas was carefully hidden but profoundly significant. Word of Saphira's actions spread through the informal communication networks that connected plantations throughout the region, carried by field hands, house servants, and the few free people of color who could travel between properties. The story of the gin house fire became a legend that was passed from person to person in whispered conversations and coded songs. The moral example provided by Saphira's action had immediate practical consequences as other enslaved people began to study their own workplaces for similar vulnerabilities. Reports of suspicious incidents increased throughout the region, including fires, equipment failures, and accidents that may or may not have been deliberately caused. The atmosphere of suspicion and fear that developed between masters and enslaved people created a level of tension that made normal plantation operations increasingly difficult to maintain. The economic disruption caused by increased security measures and reduced productivity began to affect the profitability of cotton operations throughout East Texas. Planters found themselves spending more money on supervision and security while getting less work from enslaved people who were now viewed as potential saboteurs rather than simply reluctant laborers. The cost-benefit calculations that made slavery profitable were being undermined by the fear and suspicion that followed the Thornfield Creek fire. Legal proceedings related to the incident dragged on for months as authorities attempted to determine whether other enslaved people had been involved in the planning or execution of the attack. The lack of evidence for a broader conspiracy was frustrating to investigators who were convinced that such a sophisticated operation could not have been planned and executed by a single individual. The failure to identify accomplices only added to the growing sense that the enslaved community possessed organizational capabilities that white authorities had never suspected. The destruction of the Stradal plantation created a power vacuum in the local cotton market that was filled by planters from other regions who saw an opportunity to expand their operations. However, these new investors demanded guarantees about security and insurance coverage that reflected the changed risk environment created by the possibility of internal sabotage. The terms of these new investments included provisions for enhanced security measures and emergency response capabilities that increased the cost of cotton production throughout the region. The legacy of August 7, 1852, was already becoming apparent in the changed relationships between masters and enslaved people throughout Texas. The comfortable assumptions that had allowed the plantation system to function with relatively minimal security were being replaced by a constant state of alertness and suspicion that made normal social interactions increasingly difficult. The gin house fire had accomplished something that decades of abolitionist activism had failed to achieve. It had made slavery expensive and psychologically unsustainable for the people who practiced it. As autumn approached and the full extent of the economic and social disruption became clear, plantation owners throughout Texas were forced to confront the reality that their way of life might not be as secure or permanent as they had believed. The woman who had burned down a single gin house had demonstrated that the entire system of cotton slavery was vulnerable to attack from within, and that vulnerability could not be eliminated without destroying the economic relationships that made the system profitable in the first place. The winter of 1852 brought an unprecedented wave of resistance activities across the cotton-growing regions of Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas that authorities would later trace back to the influence of what became known as the Thornfield Creek incident. Within 6 months of Saphira's action, 17 plantation operations reported suspicious fires, equipment failures, and acts of sabotage that displayed the same sophisticated understanding of industrial vulnerabilities that had characterized the destruction of the Stradal gin house. The pattern of incidents revealed a level of coordination and communication between enslaved communities that shocked white authorities who had assumed that geographic isolation and careful supervision prevented such networks from developing. Reports from across the region described simultaneous problems at cotton gins, sugar mills, and rice processing facilities that suggested enslaved workers were sharing technical knowledge about how to disable the machinery that formed the economic foundation of their oppression. In Louisiana, the Jorven sugar plantation experienced a series of equipment failures that brought processing to a halt during the critical harvest season. The massive steam-powered mill that crushed sugarcane suffered mechanical breakdowns that appeared to be caused by sand and metal filings introduced into the gear systems by someone with intimate knowledge of the machinery's operation. When investigators examined the damage, they found evidence of systematic sabotage that had been carried out over weeks with the same methodical planning that had characterized Saphira's attack. The economic impact of these coordinated resistance activities began to reshape the mathematics of slavery throughout the region. Insurance companies that had provided coverage for plantation equipment started refusing to renew policies or demanding premiums that made coverage prohibitively expensive. The increased costs of security, supervision, and equipment replacement were cutting into profit margins that had already been squeezed by falling cotton prices and rising transportation costs. Christian Draymont, one of Louisiana's most prominent sugar planters, wrote to his business associates that the combination of sabotage threats and insurance costs had made his operation unprofitable for the first time in 20 years. His correspondence, later discovered by historians, revealed the growing panic among plantation owners who realized that their economic foundation was being systematically undermined by people they had never considered capable of such sophisticated resistance. The spread of technical knowledge among enslaved communities was facilitated by the same transportation networks that carried cotton and sugar to market. Enslaved workers who accompanied their masters on business trips or who were hired out to work on riverboats and steamships carried information between plantations separated by hundreds of miles. The mobility that was necessary for plantation operations also enabled the communication systems that threatened those same operations. Methodist and Baptist church meetings, traditionally viewed by white authorities as safe outlets for enslaved people's social needs, became venues for sharing information about resistance techniques and coordinating activities across plantation boundaries. The spiritual songs and prayers that had always been part of these gatherings now carried coded messages about equipment vulnerabilities, security procedures, and the timing of planned actions. The discovery of this communication network led to systematic efforts by authorities to disrupt religious gatherings and restrict the movement of enslaved people between plantations. New laws required written passes for any travel, while church services were subjected to increased surveillance by white overseers who attempted to identify and prevent the spread of resistance-related information. However, these countermeasures proved largely ineffective because they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the networks they were trying to disrupt. The communication systems that had developed among enslaved communities were not centrally organized conspiracies that could be broken by arresting leaders or disrupting meetings. Instead, they were organic networks of mutual aid and information sharing that had grown out of the shared experience of oppression and the practical necessity of survival. The influence of Saphira's example extended beyond technical sabotage to inspire new forms of economic resistance that were harder to detect and counter. Enslaved workers began implementing deliberate slowdowns in cotton picking and processing that reduced productivity without creating obvious evidence of insubordination. The cumulative effect of these subtle forms of resistance was a decline in plantation efficiency that cost owners thousands of dollars in lost revenue. Work songs that had traditionally helped coordinate labor activities were modified to include timing signals that allowed workers to synchronize their efforts at reducing productivity. The melodies and rhythms remained the same, making the changes undetectable to white supervisors, but the lyrics now conveyed information about when to slow down, when to make mistakes, and when to resume normal productivity to avoid suspicion. The psychological impact of these coordinated resistance activities proved as significant as their economic effects. Plantation owners who had once slept peacefully in houses maintained by enslaved workers now found themselves unable to trust anyone in their employment. The intimate knowledge that house servants possessed about their masters, daily routines, personal habits, and family vulnerabilities became a source of constant anxiety. Rowick Calvane, a prominent cotton planter in eastern Texas, documented his growing paranoia in diary entries that revealed how thoroughly the threat of resistance had disrupted his family's daily life. He wrote about checking locks obsessively, testing food for poison, and maintaining loaded weapons in every room of his house. The psychological toll of living in constant fear was destroying the personal relationships and social structures that had made the plantation lifestyle attractive to wealthy families. The transformation in the relationship between masters and enslaved people was particularly evident in the breakdown of the paternalistic ideology that had justified slavery as a benevolent institution. The discovery that enslaved people possessed the intelligence and determination to plan sophisticated attacks on their oppressors made it impossible to maintain the fiction that slavery was in the best interests of the enslaved. The cognitive dissonance created by this revelation forced many white Southerners to adopt more explicitly racist justifications for their actions. Educational restrictions that had been informally enforced were formalized into legal prohibitions against teaching enslaved people to read or write. The correlation between literacy and resistance capability, demonstrated so clearly by Saphira's written confession, convinced authorities that education was a direct threat to the stability of the slave system. New laws imposed severe penalties on anyone caught providing instruction to enslaved people, while literacy tests were implemented to identify and isolate educated enslaved workers. The ripple effects of the Thornfield Creek incident reached into the highest levels of state and federal government, as politicians grappled with the implications for westward expansion and the future of slavery in new territories. Congressional debates over the organization of Western territories increasingly focused on security concerns and the ability to maintain order in regions where enslaved populations might outnumber white settlers. Military officials were consulted about the feasibility of providing armed protection for plantation operations in frontier areas where traditional forms of social control were less developed. The cost of such protection would have made many agricultural operations economically unviable, creating a fundamental contradiction between the expansion of slavery and its profitability in new territories. The transformation of enslaved communities from passive victims to active agents of resistance was perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Saphira's action. The demonstration that individual intelligence and courage could inflict serious damage on the plantation system inspired thousands of people to begin viewing their situation as something that could be changed rather than simply endured. Underground networks that had previously focused primarily on facilitating escapes to the north began incorporating sabotage and economic disruption into their activities. The same organizational capabilities that had been used to move people along the Underground Railroad were now being applied to coordinating resistance activities that could weaken slavery from within rather than simply helping individuals escape from it. Aaliyah Vorick, a free woman of color who operated a boarding house in New Orleans, became a central figure in coordinating information between resistance networks in different states. Her establishment served as a meeting place for enslaved people traveling with their masters, and she used these encounters to facilitate the exchange of technical knowledge and resistance strategies. Her activities were eventually discovered by authorities, but not before she had helped establish communication links that continued to operate long after her arrest. The economic disruption caused by coordinated resistance activities began to affect cotton markets in ways that reached far beyond individual plantations. The uncertainty created by the threat of sabotage made investors reluctant to fund new agricultural operations or expand existing ones. Cotton futures markets began incorporating, quote, political risk factors into their pricing, reflecting the growing recognition that slave resistance could affect the profitability of the entire industry. Northern textile manufacturers who depended on Southern cotton began exploring alternative sources of raw materials, including increased imports from Egypt and India. The development of these alternative supply chains reduced the economic leverage that Southern cotton producers had enjoyed in national and international markets, contributing to the relative decline of the plantation economy even before the Civil War. The intellectual awakening that Saphira's example inspired among enslaved people manifested in increased interest in literacy, technical skills, and political awareness. Despite legal prohibitions and increased surveillance, underground schools continued to operate in enslaved communities throughout the South. The curriculum of these schools increasingly emphasized practical skills that could be used for resistance, including basic engineering, chemistry, and organizational techniques. Religious leaders within enslaved communities began incorporating themes of liberation and divine justice into their teachings, drawing on biblical narratives of oppressed peoples who had overthrown their oppressors. The story of Saphira's action was woven into this religious framework, creating a theological justification for resistance that drew on both Christian and African spiritual traditions. The cultural impact of the Thornfield Creek incident extended into the development of new musical and literary traditions within enslaved communities. Songs about the gin house fire began appearing in different variations throughout the South, each version adapted to local conditions while maintaining the core message about the possibility of successful resistance. These songs served both as entertainment and as vehicles for transmitting practical information about resistance techniques. By 1854, authorities throughout the South were reporting that the slave population had become restless and insubordinate, in ways that suggested coordinated influence rather than spontaneous unrest. The cumulative effect of hundreds of small acts of resistance, inspired by Saphira's example and coordinated through the networks that had grown out of her action, was creating conditions that made the plantation system increasingly difficult and expensive to maintain. The woman who had burned down a single cotton gin had set in motion changes that were reshaping the entire landscape of American slavery. Her demonstration that enslaved people possessed both the intelligence to understand their oppressors' vulnerabilities and the courage to act on that knowledge had created a new reality in which slavery could no longer be maintained through simple force and intimidation. The psychological and economic foundations of the plantation system were being systematically undermined by people who had learned that resistance was not only possible but potentially effective. The legacy of August 7, 1852, was becoming apparent in the growing confidence of enslaved communities throughout the South and the corresponding anxiety of their masters. The balance of power that had seemed so stable and permanent was shifting in ways that would ultimately contribute to the collapse of slavery itself, proving that sometimes a single act of courage and intelligence could reshape the course of history in ways that its perpetrator could never have imagined. The ultimate fate of Saphira remains one of the great mysteries of Texas history, but her disappearance became as powerful as her action in inspiring the resistance movements that would eventually contribute to slavery's destruction. Some accounts place her among the communities of free people of color that had established themselves in the remote areas of East Texas, while others suggest that she made her way north along the underground networks that had begun incorporating her techniques into their operations. What historians do know is that reports of a mysterious woman matching Saphira's description began appearing throughout the South in the years following the Thornfield Creek incident. She was reportedly seen at plantation fires in Mississippi, equipment failures in Georgia, and organizing activities in South Carolina. Whether these sightings represented the same person or had become a legend that inspired others to claim her identity, the psychological impact was enormous on both enslaved communities and their oppressors. The economic transformation that began with the destruction of the Stradal gin house accelerated throughout the 1850s as the cumulative effects of coordinated resistance made plantation operations increasingly unprofitable. Insurance costs, security expenses, and reduced productivity combined to squeeze profit margins that had already been pressured by global market changes. By 1860, dozens of plantation operations across Texas had been abandoned or sold at significant losses, as owners concluded that the risks outweighed the potential rewards. The intellectual awakening that Saphira's action had catalyzed within enslaved communities proved to be one of its most enduring legacies. The demonstration that technical knowledge could be turned into a weapon of liberation inspired a generation of enslaved people to seek education and develop skills that would serve them both during slavery and after emancipation. Underground schools that had emerged in response to her example continued operating throughout the South, creating a foundation of literacy and technical competence that would prove crucial during Reconstruction. The strategic principles that Saphira had demonstrated, understanding your oppressor's vulnerabilities, careful planning, coordinated action, and economic disruption, became central elements of resistance theory that influenced later liberation movements far beyond the context of American slavery. Her methods were studied and adapted by organizers working against various forms of oppression, proving that the lessons learned in a Texas cotton gin had universal applications. The collapse of the plantation system that began with isolated incidents like the Thornfield Creek fire accelerated dramatically during the Civil War, when the combination of military pressure and internal resistance made slavery unsustainable even in areas that remained under Confederate control. The networks of communication and coordination that had developed in response to Saphira's example provided the organizational foundation for the mass escape and resistance activities that helped ensure Union victory. Religious traditions within African American communities preserve Saphira's story as a testament to divine justice and the power of courage in the face of overwhelming oppression. Spirituals that commemorated her action were passed down through generations, ensuring that her example continued to inspire people long after the immediate circumstances that had created her opportunity for resistance had passed into history. The site where the Stradal Plantation Gin House once stood became a place of pilgrimage for people seeking inspiration and connection to the legacy of resistance that Saphira had established. Though the physical evidence of the fire disappeared over time, local communities maintained oral traditions that preserved detailed accounts of what had happened and why it mattered for understanding the true history of slavery and resistance in America. Modern historians have struggled to separate fact from legend in accounts of Saphira's life and action, but the historical evidence clearly demonstrates that the Thornfield Creek incident marked a turning point in the relationship between enslaved people and the plantation system. The sophisticated planning, technical execution, and strategic thinking that characterized her action represented a level of resistance that fundamentally challenged the assumptions on which slavery depended. The story of the Gin House fire entered American folklore as a reminder that oppressed people possess intelligence, agency, and the capacity for strategic action that their oppressors consistently underestimate. Educational curricula that began including accounts of resistance activities alongside traditional narratives of victimization helped ensure that future generations would understand slavery as a system that was actively opposed by the people it sought to control. International observers of American slavery, including abolitionists in Europe and liberation movements in other parts of the world, seized on Saphira's story as evidence that enslaved people were capable of sophisticated resistance when given the opportunity. Her action became a symbol of universal human dignity and the refusal to accept oppression as permanent or inevitable. The technological and economic changes that transformed American agriculture in the decades following the Civil War can be traced in part to the security concerns and insurance costs that resistance activities like the Thornfield Creek fire had imposed on plantation operations. The shift toward more mechanized and less labor-intensive agricultural methods reflected not just technological progress, but also the recognition that systems dependent on coerced labor were inherently unstable and vulnerable to disruption. Mayhem's to Azali. The psychological legacy of Saphira's action extended far beyond its immediate historical context to influence how Americans understood the relationship between intelligence, courage, and social change. Her demonstration that a single person with knowledge, determination, and strategic thinking could challenge an entire system of oppression became part of the cultural foundation for later civil rights movements and social justice campaigns. Some truths burn so bright they can never be extinguished. The flames that consumed the Stradal plantation gin house on that August morning in 1852 cast a light that revealed the fundamental weakness of any system built on the denial of human dignity and intelligence. The woman who struck that first spark had proven that liberation begins in the mind of the oppressed person who refuses to accept their situation as permanent and discovers that knowledge is the most powerful weapon of all. They say that on certain August nights, when the Texas heat creates shimmering mirages on the roads near Thornfield Creek, travelers still report seeing smoke rising from the empty field where the gin house once stood. And local historians claim that documents occasionally surface in estate sales and archive collections. Technical manuals, resistance instructions, and liberation strategies written in the same careful script that authorities found in Saphira's confession letter, suggesting that her work continued long after her disappearance into legend. The fire she lit burns on in every act of resistance, every refusal to accept injustice, every demonstration that the oppressed possess the intelligence and courage to reshape the world. Subscribe to uncover more untold stories of resistance that changed the course of history. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.